Coming up to the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, someone who's just returned from Kyiv is the co-founder of Internet 2.0, Rob Potter. He's live in the studio with me. I guess you're still a bit jet lagged. You've been 5 weeks in Ukraine. What's the morale like now as we approach this 1 year anniversary of the Russian invasion?
Well, everyone's really positive in Ukraine that they're going to win, but they're also now quite concerned because the Russians have started a counter-offensive. A lot of Ukrainian positions are under significant attack by Russian forces that have recently been mobilised and trained. So there's a real sense that in the next few months that things will be decided for the future of the war. And the Ukrainians themselves are also preparing a counter-offensive against Russian positions, but they're waiting for most of the new tanks that have been promised to the Ukrainian government to arrive before they start that counter-attack against Russia.
Is there any sign the Russian counter-attack is working?
Not at the moment. They are slowly taking ground in some places, but it's been significantly less successful than people feared. So, for example, places like Bakhmut, which has been under siege for many months, there was a possibility that that was expected to fall a couple of weeks ago. But as of today, it's still in Ukrainian hands. And Russian offensives in other sections, particularly around Crimea in Donbass, have been significantly less successful than people anticipated.
We've got some pictures of your work over there, and to explain to our viewers again, for those that might not know you, what you've been doing and what your company Internet 2.0 has been doing in terms of building Ukrainian capability.
Sure. So we're there training the Ukrainian veterans in cybersecurity. So there's a huge shortage of cyber talent in Ukraine, just as there is everywhere else in the world. And there are a bunch of Ukrainians who are now veterans who've been injured or otherwise can no longer serve in frontline roles. So we're taking the best and the brightest of those people and training them in cybersecurity and putting them to work defending Ukrainian critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. And we're also doing work on countering Russian ransomware groups there.
Have you made some good progress?
Yeah, well, there's a huge amount of capability in Ukraine for us to learn from as well. So there's a lot that the Ukrainians understand about cyber attacks and cybercrime that Australia can learn from as well. There's a lot of intelligence that they've collected on these groups that is hugely useful for us. They're the first country to ever go through a real cyber war, and the amount of cyber attacks on them has been increasing by orders of magnitude every 6 to 12 months in the country since 2014. And so we're looking at those networks as emblems of what real networks under cyber pressure look like, and places like Australia can learn a lot from how they defend their networks. And they've done it in many places on real shoestring budgets.
So how are you adding value?
So we have, Australia obviously has advanced technologies that it has donated to Ukraine, some of which we can't really talk about, but many of them are doing a lot of work in helping the Ukrainians protect their networks. But we also have a lot of expertise. Australia is specialist in dealing with different sorts of malware to the Ukrainians. For example, we're experts in North Korean and Chinese malware, which isn't necessarily what the Ukrainians are fully trained on. But, you know, China still has an interest in Ukrainian networks and has previously attempted to hack their networks.
We saw Joe Biden visit Kyiv in recent days. I know you've been travelling, so you would have missed a bit of that. But what sort of impact does that have for the sense of support for Ukraine, not just from the United States, but from NATO more broadly, after that speech in Warsaw particularly?
Well, so the Ukrainians absolutely love it when foreign leaders arrive for two reasons. One, it gives them a sense of solidarity. And the second is usually those days they don't get missile strikes because the Russians don't want to risk killing a world leader and starting a broader war. So probably the second most popular politician in Ukraine is Boris Johnson. They even write pop songs about him because very early in the war he went to Kyiv. So there's a huge benefit in being there. The Ukrainians love the sense of solidarity they get, and they really appreciate that President Biden was there. And there was a huge excitement in Kyiv, even though I was already out of the country when he arrived, that there was a huge promise of him being there. And there's a huge sense of solidarity from the Americans by having President Biden go there. It also shows that he's confident in Ukrainian security. He's confident that the Ukrainians can defend him. Another really great example of that was when I was there. President Zelensky visited Bakhmut. So Bakhmut is clearly under significant Russian pressure, but Zelensky kind of thumbed his nose at Vladimir Putin, went to Bakhmut before he went to address the US Congress.
So when you look at the situation the conflict is in now, how would you rate Ukraine's chances of not only surviving but defeating Russia in this?
Well, yeah, there's two phases to this, right? The first is defeating the Russian military, which is something 12 months ago no one was really predicting was going to happen. There were a lot of people who thought the Ukrainian military would collapse in 3 days. Certainly that's what the Russians were planning on. However, that didn't happen. The Ukrainians impressed the world. The Ukrainian army today is larger, stronger, better armed and better equipped than the Ukrainian army of 12 months ago.
With more tanks coming.
With more tanks coming. And even today, their artillery rates of fire, the amount of ammunition that they're able to spend each day are orders of magnitude higher than they were 12 months ago. And the Russian army today is nothing near as good as the one that invaded them in February last year. So while it's still an open question as to whether or not the Ukrainians can liberate all of their occupied territories from the Russian army, but we're quite confident now that the Ukrainians will be able to hold their front, particularly given the underperformance of the Russian counteroffensive.
What did you think of the Putin speech and the concert that was held over the last 24 hours? I know, as I said, you're jet lagged, you just got back yesterday. I'm not sure if you've caught up with all of it, but from what you've seen of it, is it just more propaganda? What's that all about? Can it be believed?
Well, there's always a lot of assessments that go into what Putin's speech is going to be. One of the things that we do is we monitor Russian disinformation. And so ahead of every Vladimir Putin announcement, he will always talk in there will always be talk in great detail of what he's going to cover. He's going to talk about liberating regions, but he postponed that speech many times before he finally went before his people to give it, because he was expecting to be announcing victories. But those victories haven't happened. And so what we get from Putin is a man who's under a lot of pressure. He's dealing with someone like Vladimir Zelensky, who's the world's most popular leader. He's an incredibly popular politician in Ukraine. And most of the photos of Putin are him behind a very long desk talking to generals in a stern voice and being not very charismatic. So he's under pressure from his public and from his advisors to be more public and be more open in his communication. So he goes out and gives a large speech. But those speeches are not particularly his native terrain. He's not very good as a public performer. He's really better at influence. And what you saw was a bit of a rant. And the main thing that he was speaking to there was not military capability, but he's really speaking to an audience of fellow travellers. That's why he's talking about social policy. It's why he's talking about American culture. It's why he's talking about transgender people in the United States, because he's trying to radicalise a particular section of the US electorate, knowing that there's a presidential election coming up.
Yeah, right. Interesting. So that information campaign from Moscow all the way to the United States. Rob Potter, welcome back from Ukraine. We'll stay in touch.
Thanks for having me.